I think we should say that those nominated for the best performance by an actor are
Marlon Brando in The Godfather,
Michael Caine in Sleuth,
Laurence Olivier in Sleuth,
Peter O'Toole in The Ruling Class,
Paul Winfield in Sounder. The winner is Marlon Brando in The Godfather.
Accepting the award for Marlon Brando and The Godfather, Miss Shasheen Littlefeather.
Hello, my name is Shasheen Littlefeather. I'm Apache, and I'm president of the National Native American Affirmative Image Committee. I'm representing Marlon Brando this evening, and he has asked me to tell you in a very long speech, which I cannot share with you presently because of time, but I will be glad to share with the press afterwards, that he very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award. And the reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry, and on television in movie reruns, and also with recent happenings at Wounded Knee. I beg at this time that I have not intruded upon this evening, and that we will, in the future, our hearts and our understandings will meet with love and generosity. Thank you on behalf of Marlon Brando.
This is KZSC 88.1 FM, kzsc.org.
The following program was pre-recorded. KZSC want to thank everyone who contributed to our fall fundraising drive. As a student-run community radio station, we cannot do it without you. Your generosity has employed students, trained journalists, and literally kept the lights on here at KZSC. In total, our listeners contributed over $12,000 this past week alone. Remember, it's not too late to join this wonderful group of listeners. If you missed the opportunity to contribute last week, you can still go to kzsc.fm/give to donate, and kzsc.fm/shop still has plenty of t-shirts, tote bags, and masks up for sale. Once again, thank you for making our community station run. As a non-commercial educational radio station, KZSC supports the free expression of ideas. Please be aware that the opinions expressed are those of the speakers or artists only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the UC Regents, KZSC staff, management, or underwriters. We welcome your feedback on our programming. Please direct your comments to the Program Review Committee at 831-459-4726 or by email at prc@kzsc.org. Girls, 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 are you in touch with your feminine side? Tune into Girls Gone Mild on KZSC Santa Cruz on Mondays from 4 to 6 p.m. DJ Honeybucket understands that the modern definition of girl is gender neutral. Everyone is welcome. Join DJ Honeybucket on 88.1 for your weekly dose of femme rock and roll. Santa Cruz County Community Coalition to Overcome Racism is a grassroots organization founded in 2007 to address structural racism as the root cause of racial inequity in Santa Cruz County. Their mission is to train, equip, and support community members and institutions to effectively work toward racial equity. More information is available at info@scccccor.org. Gina Dent and Angela Davis recently kicked off a year-long series of online events focused on prison abolition called Visualizing Abolition. For more information, check out the website for the Institute of Arts and Sciences at UCSC. This is KZSC 88.1 FM broadcasting from the University of California at Santa Cruz. My name is John Malkin. This is Transformation Highway. Today I'm very pleased to have here with me in the studio Marty Rizzo. And Marty, I met 15 years ago and have now re-met, and it's a pleasure to know you again. I have just read Marty's 2016 thesis. He received a PhD here at the University of California in Santa Cruz last year. And his thesis is titled No Somos Animales, Indigenous Survival and Perseverance in 19th Century Santa Cruz, California. It's a dissertation submitted in partial satisfaction for the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in History here at UCSC. I want to warmly welcome you to the program.
Thank you, John. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate your having me as a guest, and you're taking the time to read through my dissertation.
I really enjoyed it and appreciated it, especially knowing that today is this day that we call Thanksgiving. We all grew up with that, and people are preparing meals and getting ready to get together and enjoy friendship and family and sharing of food. And we all, I think, grew up with this idea that this came from, this meal, this getting together came from a beautiful coming together of Native Americans and the European settlers who came here, who a lot of us are descendants from. And that's a pretty incomplete, maybe problematic even story. And you've written your thesis about with the focus on the indigenous people who lived here. And I think some of us know a bit about them and who they were and are and what's become of them. But the detail of your writing is really profound, I think. And I'm really glad to hear that you're hoping to make it a book that will be available for everyone to read. So I'm grateful that you're here on this day, especially.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It's funny, as I'm sure my family could attest, I was always that guy who would, at Thanksgiving, stop and say, hey, let's think about Native history and talk about this. And it's nice to be able to do that on the air on a kind of a broader audience. What I've kind of always focused on. And I think one of the things that comes to mind too, and having this on Thanksgiving is, you're right. It is typically celebrates this kind of mythologized, kind of peaceful interaction to this colonial history. But I think a lot of people focus on giving thanks, and what comes to mind for me is I really think, if we want to give thanks. So many people today, especially in California, but throughout the United States, throughout the Americas, don't really have a sense of whose land that they're living on. And I think that, to me, if you really want to give thanks to living, here in Santa Cruz, we live in a very beautiful place, but it's important to take the time and to learn, whose land are we on? If you're anywhere really in the world, you're on somebody's homeland, and so our society is so disconnected from this concept. But it's really important, I think, for people to learn, whose land is this that we live on? Give thanks to them, and also to understand, where are they today? What is going on for the people who call this land home for thousands of years? Since the beginning of time. What is their situation today, and to think about all these types of things. So I would say, if you want to give thanks, that's one way that you can give thanks is by reaching out and doing that. And actually, if I may, kind of to connect it here with Santa Cruz, but the people who, the contemporary tribe today who call Santa Cruz home is the Amah Mutsun tribal nation, who their members trace back to Mission Santa Cruz and Mission San Juan Bautista. And today, most of the members live throughout the Bay Area, or some of them in Southern California as well. Most of them actually can't afford to live in Santa Cruz, which is becoming increasingly common. But if people want to learn more, they can visit the Amah Mutsun website. But the other thing too is right now there's a battle going on where the Amah Mutsun are trying to protect what is really one of the last of local sacred sites, and it's a place called Juristac. Which is an old village site. It's over by Gilroy, Morgan Hill area, kind of the southern edge of the Santa Cruz Mountains. But there's a movement right now, or they're trying to turn it into a gravel pit. And the Amah Mutsun, along with others, are basically trying to protect the site. There's an old village site. It's also the site of what was called a Kuksui, or the Big Head Dance, which was a kind of an intertribal gathering and goes back thousands of years, where kind of spiritual members of different tribes would come together and celebrate this ceremony. So it's a very sacred site, and if people want to learn more about it, there's a petition online that they can look at. The website is called Protect Juristac, and Juristac is spelled JURISTAC.org. So protectjuristac.org. It'd be worth visiting.
Great, thank you. I'd love to hear about some of your findings and research in what was going on here in Santa Cruz in the late 1700s. You write in your thesis that in 1793, a pan-tribal indigenous group attacked the newly founded Mission Santa Cruz. Nearly 20 years later, an indigenous woman named Fausta helped to strategize and lead an assassination of an abusive padre. Rebellions, assassinations, fugitive flights, and poisonings. Santa Cruz indigenous communities resisted and challenged colonial violence throughout the 19th century. By the time the Mexican officials closed Mission Santa Cruz in 1834, the total surviving indigenous population numbered around 250, which is a small fraction of the 2,753 indigenous people baptized at the mission. If you don't mind, there's a lot of material in that paragraph. People probably don't know that a padre was assassinated here. People probably don't know that there was a lot of collaboration between native tribes here. And also, that the what I found interesting, partly in your writing, was about the baptism process. A lot of this violence was based in this really intense Catholicism of baptizing children first, and then trying to lure in parents and. Talk about, maybe start with that, the baptism and the church's role here in creating the mission and the violence that followed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a lot of points to unpack in that one. I think that to start with, in the early years when the Spanish first came, Santa Cruz, they established Mission Santa Cruz 1791. Really it came into what is now Monterey in 1769-70, right around the turn there. So in those first maybe 30 years, up until the early 1800s, really, the Spanish presence was a much smaller presence than the indigenous presence, which would, of course, make sense as the Spanish Franciscans were trying to kind of get a foothold with establishing their missions. And so I think in the early years, what we find is that the process of colonization of what the Spanish referred to as the spiritual conquest of native people through Catholicism was one that started kind of in a less overtly violent way. And by the 1800s, it became a little bit more, or quite a bit more violent in terms of soldiers being used to kind of capture fugitives and, pull in villages. But in the early years, they did, it was more of a kind of enticement. The Spanish would bring with them certain material goods, cloth and beads. Now, beads, as archaeologists have looked at, became enmeshed in the economic system of indigenous peoples who used these olivea shells. But very quickly, they started incorporating these Spanish beads, glass beads. So the Spanish would bring these goods. Native peoples would often come visit them. And being spiritual people who had their own kind of pluralistic approach to spirituality, and by that I mean, for Native people here, they didn't see this kind of exclusivity that we see with Catholicism, right? That it's my way or the highway, right? This kind of, if you're not Catholic, then you're pagan, and therefore wrong or of the devil. And for Native people, here's a great example of this that Randy Milliken brought up. But when the Spanish first got to Angel Island in the Bay Area, they came across a sacred site where they saw Native peoples had kind of some offerings and feathers and certain types of things. You could tell it was a sacred kind of an altar or prayer spot. And so the priest who found this wrote about it, and he says, we found this site, and so of course we burned it down, being pagan. And in contrast, another story: Spanish worked their way through Santa Clara Valley in the early years, and they had stopped, and it must have been a particular day of celebration for the Catholics, and so they set up some of their crosses and stuff. They returned to this area, and it was by Coyote Creek, and they passed by about a year later, and what they found was these crosses that they had put there a year before were still there, but now they were adorned with feathers and offerings. And so for the Native people, they saw the crosses and said, oh, okay, the Spanish recognize this as a sacred spot, as a sacred moment, and so they added to that. And I think that particular divide in approach to spirituality, to understanding the world, is a really revealing one. And I think that for a lot of Native people, they didn't realize that by taking communion, by becoming baptized, from a Spanish point of view, they weren't allowed to leave the mission afterwards. The Spanish saw them as kind of spiritual children, neophytos, they called them. And so this process was a tricky one. Native people would come in for different reasons. Some of it as the ecological situation changed, and so some of their foodstuffs weren't available. So for all these different reasons, they would come in there. And then once baptized, they really weren't allowed to leave the mission site again, and they then would be forced into labor, and they become laborers for this Spanish colonial settlement. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things. One of the other things that you bring up, because you're right that I think it was just one sentence, but it's quite a involved one. But another, I think, big point that comes out of that, and one of the themes that I try to say, because a lot of people ask, and they look at the missions, California missions, and they say, well, okay, so you have, maybe in some places 500, Santa Cruz kind of peaked at about 500, but like Mission Santa Clara, you had a couple thousand Native people there at any some particular moments. People always ask, well, if these were such horrific conditions, and you mentioned the, I think over 90% of mortality rates here. And that's across the board in California, pretty much average between 85 and 90% of people died. But people ask, well, if these conditions were so horrific, why didn't they rebel? Or, there's this conception that Native peoples just kind of passively did this. And when I looked at this, what I found is quite the opposite, as Native peoples found all sorts of ways to rebel, from outright rebellion and attacks, like you mentioned with the Quiroste Rebellion, or the assassination of Padre Quintana 20 years later. Innumerable accounts of fugitives, people running away, going back to their homelands, soldiers being sent after them, rumors of poisoning, things like this. But there was resistance. There's even work stoppages and all sorts of ways that people found to resist. But I would even argue that given this 90% mortality rates, survival itself was an act of resistance and rebellion in this world. And so I think some of the things I found was that some Native people did collaborate with the Padres and found ways to kind of work within the mission system. And I would say, given the difficult, devastating times that they're going through, any way that people could find to survive was really an act of rebellion in itself.
Mm-hmm. Would you describe the story of the 1812 assassination of Padre Andres Quintana? You write that it's the only successful assassination of a padre in the Northern California missions. And as you just mentioned, you write that my research reveals that this incident was much more than an isolated moment of rebellion. How did that develop, and what was the result of that happening for Indigenous people and the occupying Catholic mission folks?
Yeah. Let's see. So I guess the first thing I would say is this Padre Quintana, and it's worth noting. So he came from Spain, as most of these Padres did, and they maybe spent like a year down in Mexico City at the Colegio de San Fernando, and get a little bit of training. They get sent up here. Now, our conception of these Padres, I think most people imagine, these kind of old men, frail old men. But that wasn't really the case. In fact, Quintana, when he arrived, I think was 25 years old, a very young man, put in charge of, some 300 to 400 Native peoples. And it would be two Padres and maybe a couple soldiers here. So this power dynamic, I think, was ripe for abuses, and was a type of thing where the Catholics were going under this assumption of cultural inferiority. They were assuming that the Native people here were basically children, spiritual children, which of course they weren't. And so it creates this dynamic. And now Quintana himself was a particularly sadistic fellow, and he was noted for, in fact, in the days leading up to the assassination, he had made a special horsewhip fitted with iron straws in it. So as if these whips and whippings were a common way of kind of corporal punishment for Native people at the hands of the Padres. And a lot of people died at these. I mean, these are not kind of your 50 Shades of Grey type of whips. This is like, cutting through and potentially killing people. And that wasn't even enough for this guy Quintana. So he had to add to this. And in the moments leading up to it, the story says that he had beaten two young men nearly to death leading up to this. And so there was a meeting. And we know this because it's really one of the great benefits that we have, this oral history that was handed down by a fellow Lorenzo Asesada, who gave some interviews later in life, and his father had been one of the conspirators involved. And so he describes that a group of about 15, 20 men and women got together and basically said, okay, what are we going to do about this guy, about Quintana? And one of the things they said, according to his account, is they said, he doesn't practice what he preaches. He doesn't, his actions are not the same as what he says in his sermons. And so they said, we need to do something about this. And so they developed a plan, and it was put together. And really what's interesting, when I started looking at who the people are involved and started tracing out, their identities, I realized there's at this point in time, 1812, the demographics were shifting. So local Ohlone people, the people who spoke the Waswas language from like the direct Santa Cruz Mountains, had really become a small minority at this point. They were consisted about maybe 30% of the overall population. There's a lot of Mutsun speakers who were Ohlone from kind of more Gilroy over the hill area. That was another maybe 30%. And then the other third was these incoming Yokuts people who came from over in the San Joaquin Valley. And so you have this very linguistically and culturally diverse population within there. But when I broke down and looked at who were all the people involved, I was actually surprised to see it was all of them, with the exception of one person, came from the local tribes. And so you really have some of the people who've been around the longest and their families. And it was actually a kind of an expanded kinship network. You see the young man Lino, who was the kind of oldest child born in the mission at the time. He had been the personal page to Quintana, and he's one of the key people. His father, his uncle were involved, some of his cousins and other people connected to him. And so they put together a plan, and the really fascinating part is that the one person that I mentioned who wasn't from local tribes, she had married one of the local guys, leaders, but this is this woman, Fausta. Her native name is Yakanansat. She was baptized as Fausta. And she comes in, and she was a leader from a tribe over in the Henry Coe mountain area called the Sumu tribe. And so she came in, and I started digging into her history, and it seems pretty clear that she was either most likely a spiritual leader within that tribe. And so she put forth this idea, and she said, why don't we, her husband had been sick, so she said, we'll call the Padre in to administer last rites to my husband. I'll go fetch the Padre, and then people will kill him, and then we'll put him back in. And basically the plan was to make it look as if he died of natural causes, which was successful. Now, another interesting thing that I think about Fausta is that the story goes that when they actually did, she called in Padre Quintana once, and the men who were supposed to take care of killing him chickened out and decided not to. And so it actually, she called them in again to administer last rites again. And again, they didn't carry through with this. And so then Fausta actually threatens them and says, hey, if you don't do it, I'm going to do it one more time. If you don't do it, then I'm going to reveal the whole plot, and everyone's going to get in trouble. So what's really revealed here is that this woman, Fausta, was not only the one who developed the plan, came up with this idea, but really is the key person who makes this all happen, which I found pretty interesting. And so they do carry through on this third attempt. They put his body back in, and Lino, who's the personal page of his, basically plays it off, and eventually the soldiers come in the next day and say, hey, what happened? Oh, we think he's sleeping. And they get him, and they realize, oh, he's dead. And apparently for about a year, well, the other interesting thing is that night, so the young men and women, unmarried men and women, were kept in locked dormitories, locked up at nights, presumably to keep them from getting together, this type of thing. And after they killed Quintana, they said that they went and got the keys and unlocked the dormitories and had kind of a celebration. So this is something that the whole community at the time would be aware of, right? I mean, this is an unusual event. And yet, for about a year, we don't know the exact date of when the Spanish found out about what had actually happened, but it lasted about a year where the whole community kind of kept it quiet. The soldiers overheard some people speaking about this, and then they arrested 15 men, marched them up to San Francisco. And then about 9 of them were convicted, and of those 9, 7 of them died, didn't even survive their sentences. Now, once they were put into prison, they were put to hard labor. They were each assigned, I think, 200 lashings. Now, I think 5 of them didn't even survive the lashings, it looks like, and died fairly quickly, including Lino. And only 2 of them actually survived that. And one of the people who survived had a hard time finding him, but I was able to trace him. He apparently moved into the mountains upper in Big Sur area and kind of lived on the peripheries of Spanish settlement, which you can understand why he would then choose to live a little ways away there. So the other thing you're asking is, what was the aftermath of this? And, I think it's interesting, and I found a couple letters that referred to Mission Santa Cruz as the mission of Padre killers, or the mission of, basically in different ways of saying that. And in one of these letters, what's really interesting is Esteban Tapiz, who's at that point he was kind of the leader of the Franciscans, and he had come over to Mission Santa Cruz to check in, and I guess they had just arrested three men for attempted poisonings, and so he's trying to calm people down in his letter. He says, I'm here at the mission of Padre killers, and he says, I think everything's fine. He says, the people who caused the problem have all been arrested and taken care of. Everything seems great here. And then at the end of the thing, he says, and by the way, if it's all right with you, I'd just as soon get out of here and head back to my mission. And so you kind of read this and think, well, how, what was the state of things here? It's hard to know exactly, what was going on. But you do see a big shift right after that. And after that, the assassination there, these incoming Yokuts people, tribal people, end up kind of assuming a lot of leadership roles. And so it looks to me as if the Padres in charge kind of basically in some ways pitted a different tribe against some of the folks who have been there from longer. And so you kind of see a shift in leadership within the mission itself. So some interesting changes within the mission afterwards.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm speaking with Marty Rizzo, and Marty has written a thesis about the history of Indigenous people here in Santa Cruz. He's also a teacher at UCSC and Cabrillo College and in jails. Is that in the Santa Cruz County Jail, or where do you teach?
I've been teaching history classes over at Salinas Valley State Prison, so over by Soledad, over the last year here. Yeah.
Are you teaching this stuff, local history, or other?
A little bit. I'm doing right now I'm doing kind of an early U.S. history class, although I was just there yesterday where we were teaching about the Andrew Jackson and Indian removal in that process. But and then we'll talk about California in the coming weeks. So a little bit, but it's mostly kind of a national U.S. history, and it's a new program. I actually teach through Hartnell College, and the inmates get community college credit for the classes, which is fascinating. And I have to say, I mean, they definitely have been some of my most motivated and interesting students by far. They definitely come having read everything thoroughly with a million questions and a lot of comments and thoughts. So it's been a pretty fascinating experience there. Yeah.
I'm curious what has drawn you to exploring local Indigenous history so much. And connected with that, how much of this information is readily available? For example, if you go to the Mission in Santa Cruz, they have a visitor center. There is the Holy Cross Church right there where there's a graveyard. Is Padre Quintana buried there? There's some graves, but I don't know if he's buried there. How much of this is readily taught and known?
Yeah, okay, a couple of good questions. I'll answer the how much is available now. I think that there actually is a burial site for Quintana. An interesting word on burials there. So any of the California missions are really surrounded by burial sites. Partly, as we mentioned, the 90% death rate within the missions, there is obviously an obvious need for burials. Mission Santa Cruz, the actual original mission, fell down in an earthquake in the 1850s. And so what we have there now is this Victorian-style replica, or not really replica, but Victorian-style mission, Holy Cross. And when they built that, they actually ended up taking, so this was in the 1870s, and they basically unearthed a couple thousand bodies there. And it wasn't only Native people, but it was mostly some of the Spanish settlers and folks from the Villa de Branciforte as well. But they took these bodies, they loaded them into wheelbarrows and took them over to it's off of SoCal Frontage Road, but there's the other old cemetery there. And just in the last year, and back in June, they finally, there was basically a mass grave where they put everyone. And up until last June, there was a little marker there that had this kind of little thing attached that said Indian burials on it. And that was about it. And then the the cemetery just worked with the Amah Mutsun to actually build a monument there. And so the Amah Mutsun came last June, I think on solstice, and had a ceremony there to kind of honor the dead and the bodies that are down there. So a lot of those, anyway, that's kind of a side there. But there are still bodies underneath the parking lot next to the mission, and this is kind of a case at a lot of missions. But as far as how much stuff is publicly available, I did a lot of my archival work all over. So I spent 3 months in Mexico City and got quite a bit of documents from the archives down there. I spent a lot of time at Mission Santa Barbara archive library there, and there's a ton of stuff there. But there is increasingly more and more stuff that becomes posted online in different archives. And one of the great resources that is available for people is there's an online site that was put together by Steve Hackle and folks over at the Huntington Library, and it's called the Early California Population Project. And it's a database, a searchable, sortable database where people can go on. And what they've done is they've uploaded all of the, one of the best documents we have is that the missionaries really took meticulous notes at every baptism, every burial, every marriage, and a lot of the confirmations. And so they would, and it varied on which Padre is doing it, which mission. But a lot of times they would actually put in like what village site the person came from, who their parents were, a lot of biographical information. And so you can search through this database. And what I did was I basically, I painstakingly took entry by entry and some 7,000 entries and created my own database. And then by doing that, I was able to kind of sort, and that's how I was able to track, like, say, the people involved with the Quintana assassination, was I went through and traced out each name that I could find and try to figure out, okay, who is this person? How are they connected? What are the family lines, their family trees? And by doing this, it kind of gives you a much more kind of three-dimensional sense of who the folks were who were here. What was their tribal affiliation? What tribe they come from? What lands they come from? And that was probably the biggest thing that I did in terms of my research. So this is all stuff that's publicly available. It's just a matter of kind of putting it together in a way that, and then lining it up with the other documents to kind of trace out these stories. The other side of the question that you asked is, I think you asked why did I get interested in this? It's a good question. So a lot of it has to do with my own family history and growing up. And I was always aware as a kid, my family, my father's family and my grandfather, on my father's side, had come from New Mexico. And the stories I grew up with had to do with colonialism in New Mexico. And we trace back, the stories say, back to the earliest settlements, some of the earliest families, the Martínez family that came up and settled in the early 1600s. When I was a child, I think I was about 7, and I took a trip with my dad and my brother and sister, and we went to go visit my uncle in Flagstaff. And my dad's very much into history. He was the one who always related these fascinating stories that captured my imagination. And so we visited I think it might have been a Western Apache kind of some ruins there. And so we go visit like a little site there. And as we were walking through, we saw a sign that had some pictures of some Apache folks. And we stopped there, and we all kind of stood in awe. And my dad pointed at this one guy and said, "Hey, who does that look like?" And we're staring, and for my 7-year-old brain, it's like, that's Grandpa. What the heck is Grandpa doing here? And that's when my dad said, well, we come from New Mexico, and in New Mexico is a lot of mixed blood, and Grandpa has some native blood. And so for my 7-year-old brain, ever after, I thought, oh, when I'd hear about Native Americans, I think of my grandpa, who I love dearly and who was a great guy. It's much more complex than that as I've gone, but this question kind of came into my head as a 7-year-old of, what is the relation to my relation to indigeneity, to Spanish colonialism? And I'd hear these stories, and the stories were always from the Spanish point of view of, this great, proud Spanish thing. But I was fortunate to kind of grow up in an era, the 70s and 80s, where things were shifting, and being Indian wasn't such a stigmatized thing. And so I always was curious, and I'd ask my dad, "Hey, what about the native side, though? On that?" And there wasn't much, and so but these questions always were in my head. So when I moved to Santa Cruz back in '98, I always kind of had that question. I'm like, "Hey, who are the people from here?" And I had the great fortune of taking classes with a man he was a teacher of mine and became a dear friend, a mentor, and mostly a dear friend these days, Stan Rushworth, who teaches, he's a Cherokee man who teaches Native literature there at Cabrillo. And so I talked to him about it. Say, hey, what happened to the Native people here? And most people I'd ask that kind of thing too. They'd say, oh, they just disappeared. And Stan was always quick to say, I don't know. Why don't you go find out? What can you find? So, and just encouraged me to kind of look deeper. And as I kind of just took that further and thought, well, hey, I want to find out, what is the story here of Native people? And a lot of people say, oh, there's not much. And as you can see, I found there's actually a lot out there if you look for it. And I think that's in most places. I think a lot of places people say, oh, there's not much. But if you were to look for it, I'm sure you'd find quite a bit.
I'm talking with Marty Rizzo, and we're talking about his research that was put into writing in his thesis, doctorate thesis here at the University of California in Santa Cruz. It's titled No Somos Animales, and it's about the history of Indigenous people in Santa Cruz. I grew up Jewish and raised with this history of the Holocaust of Jewish people in World War II. And I think a lot of people are aware of that time and even some rough details of what happened, even a number that were taught of those who were killed. That number is usually 6 million. Growing up in the United States, I don't feel like I had a lot of details about what happened to Native people here in the genocide that happened, and even a rough number or estimates of numbers of people who were killed in what is now the United States was not something we were taught in any schooling throughout my whole schooling. I have looked to try to find out how many people were here, and people like Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky have come up with some rough numbers. I wonder what you think the number of people that the indigenous people that lived in what we now call the United States, what that number was, and what that number was on the West Coast, San Francisco, Santa Cruz, Big Sur area. What do you think?
Gosh, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I'm going to have the exact numbers lined up here. It's devastating, however it is, and this is something that's been contested for a long time, and it is a somewhat difficult thing to really figure out. And in California, a lot of kind of the more, I think, recent thoughts have really tried to focus on, what was the, like food resource availability, how many people could have been there. I think, what we find in the local area is Santa Cruz, because a lot of the tribes were living more kind of in and out of the mountains, meaning that their territories kind of overlapped with some of the mountainous terrain. And so the lifestyles there, there's a local archaeologist, Mark Hilkema, who's done a lot of work on this, about the Santa Cruz Mountains in particular. He points out that, there are areas that where kind of the mountains kind of end, you get a little more plateaus and kind of grasslands. And now throughout the mountains, you'd get these little pockets of grasslands. And the grass, of course, was a super important resource in terms of basketry, in terms of so many goods that are made. But if you look locally, and I'll take it back, circle back around. You mentioned at the very beginning, there's an attack on Mission Santa Cruz by a group led by the Juristac. And I think the largest and most powerful group in kind of the local area lived up in Año Nuevo. And if you drive up and down the coast, it kind of makes sense if you really think about it, because right around Año Nuevo is where you kind of get a little bit more clearing and opening, these valleys right there, now what we call Juristac Valley, named after a tribe. But in the Portola expedition, when the Spanish first came, that was the first overland Spanish expedition through this area, and they reported, they came through in the fall, which is a time where a lot of the tribes were kind of receding up into the mountains a little bit more, kind of burning off the grasslands. They do annual burnings. And they saw a lot of evidence of this in a lot of like empty village sites where they'd see just a couple people. And the Spanish at that point were starving and really struggling health-wise to get through. But when they did come across a large number of people up in the Quiroste Valley there, and they called the Casa Grande, it was like the big house. But this, we now know, was this tribe, the Quiroste tribe. And the Quiroste tribe was not only a larger in terms of demographics, which is true, but they also, that area had two really vital resources. One, they had these Olivaeus shell beads, which I mentioned earlier as the currency. And so in some ways, this tribe was the banker for the region, so they could trade a lot of these shells. The other thing they had was what's called Monterey chert, which was used as arrowheads. They would use obsidian up north in like Napa Valley. It's where they get the obsidian. But around here, they mostly use this Monterey chert. And so this one tribe, the Quiroste, were really kind of the most powerful, largest tribe of the region. How many did they number? It's hard to say exactly. I mean, it was in the probably under 1,000, in there, up in the hundreds. So, before the Spanish came here, and they persisted for a while, and that was their lands became kind of a haven for runaways in the early years. And so what happened by this attack, 1793 that I mentioned, was they were getting encroached on, and the particular lead up to this attack was some of the women from this tribe had been baptized at Mission Santa Cruz and married to other folks, and this really kind of interfered with the marriage pattern, or who they were already supposed to be marrying within the tribe, and so this led to kind of an attack from the folks who are kind of housed up in this area. And very quickly after that, the result of this attack, this direct attack, they burned down a couple of villages, buildings around the mission, and they also wounded some of the soldiers here. And then the Spanish military presence increased dramatically right after that. And then this particular Quiroste tribe was kind of split up into different ways. Most of them were sent over to Mission Santa Clara in the years after, so they kind of basically broke up what was left of this tribe. So anyway, I don't think I answered your number question, but I took that in a different direction. But yeah, but back to the numbers. I mean, I think that the numbers, in any way you look at it, I mean, devastating losses. A lot of that's from disease, but it's a combination of disease, disruption, violence, colonial violence, all sorts of things.
I think some of the numbers I was seeing Howard Zinn coming up with what is now the United States, between 15 and 25 million people, something like that.
Yeah.
And I've heard, I don't know if it's accurate, that most indigenous people that lived in what is now the United States lived on this coast, which sort of would make sense with the climate and rivers and ocean and...
Yeah, California is so fascinating because it's such a, even to today, in its own way, it's an extremely diverse place. You have a lot of people from all over the world. Indigenous California, they mostly, probably the most common way you see this is mapped linguistically by linguistic anthropologists who kind of do studies and try to see. And it's... that's a good example there. But what's so fascinating is that there's so many languages spoken within California, and very distinct languages that have very different backgrounds. And so what you see, the Chumash language is closely related to some languages down in Mexico. I've spoken to some Chumash people who say that there's some similarities, some Polynesian languages out there as well. So there's all these different tribes, different communities that live throughout this area. So really, Indigenous California is one of the most diverse and populated areas. And I think part of it is the temperature and the temperament of California, too, has always drawn a lot of people out here. So there's a ton of resources. I mean, it's just a very lush place, and continues to be. I mean, this area right here is still, probably the produce capital of the world. They're pretty close to it, if not. Yeah.
Marty, we just have 2 or 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure you bring up whatever you think is most important on today, which is Thanksgiving. We're talking about the local indigenous populations that no longer exist. It's hugely diverse, as you're pointing to what was going on here in the late 1700s. I'm looking at one of your maps from your thesis, the tribes and the languages, and I don't know most of these, or I don't know that I've heard about them. Sayanta, Akistatka, Katoni, Partashi, Chidiktak, I don't know how to pronounce them, Chupaktak, and all within a small area, Aptos, it's fascinating how many different peoples were living here. I don't know what you want to end with. What's most important? One thing I'd be curious to hear just a minute about is Indigenous people who are still here and what they're doing. If you know them and know how many are around and what they're up to.
You know, I think that's a great place to end on that. A quick note on the name. Some of these names persist. You see Aptos, of course. Soquel, which is so prominent here. That was the name of the chief of the tribe, the Oipi tribe in downtown Santa Cruz. The Zayanta is now Zayanti. So you see some of these names, but a lot of them, you don't see at all. Let's talk a little bit about contemporary Native peoples. And I think, one of the biggest themes that I found in this is that the diversity of people. So Ohlone people, what we call Ohlone today, was around 50 different independent tribes throughout the Bay Area. And these tribes, they had a lot of, they were tied together through spiritual, social, economic ties, all these types of things, kinship, and but they also had rivalries. So it's not like they were kind of a cohesive unit. I mean, they worked together at times, and then they had rivalries as well. And I think one of the things I hear today, people say, well, contemporary Native people, they have differences. Why don't they just all have the same point of view, or why can't they agree on these things? Which, if you think about it, is kind of a preposterous thing to put on any population, right? Would you say that to the white population of the United States? That'd be ridiculous. So, but I think if you look at the history is that, there's been a lot of different ways people take, there's a diversity of peoples, diversity of tactics people use, and you still see it today. And so in some ways you have these larger tribes like the Amah Mutsun who hail from this area right here. You have the Muwekma to the north, which is kind of the East Bay area. And then you have the Esselen Nation down by Monterey down there too. So you have a handful of, and there's a couple others too of these kind of larger ones, but then you also have groups like, or independent people. You have over in Indian Canyon, one of the few people to actually hold on to lands is Anne-Marie Sayers and her daughter Canyon. And they do wonderful things, with the indigenous community. A lot of Native folks from all over the world have moved into the area. And they kind of hold ceremony for all sorts of people there and offer space. And so so you have a real diversity. You also have up in the East Bay, Karina Gould, who is doing fantastic things to try to bring awareness to protecting shell mounds and sacred sites up there. I've had the fortune to meet some of them. I'd love to meet others, but I think they are visible. I would advise anyone to find out what are local Native people doing today, and how can you help them? How can you get involved with what they're working on?
Fantastic. I'm really appreciative of the research you've done, and thank you for coming here today. I'm speaking with Marty Rizzo, and what kind of time frame do you think you have for completing your book that has the history of local Indigenous people? I know it's a long process.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great honor, and it's great to see you again and to come here and talk about this. It's hard to say. I'm hoping to do a bunch of the editing in the spring here, and we'll see. I've been talking to a publisher, so I'm hoping for another year and a half, something like along those lines. We'll see how it goes.
Mm-hmm. Is there any way people can keep in touch with you and know when that might happen? And is there a good place you might point people for information about Indigenous culture locally?
There's some great books out here. There's a great book by Randy Milliken, A Time of Little Choice, which is a great read. For people interested in the American era, Benjamin Madley wrote a book last year called An American Genocide, which is about California history during the American years. People can email me at mrizzo@ucsc.edu if they want to keep in touch. I do have my dissertation out online, so people can download it and read it too, like you did. So I'm happy to point people towards other resources as well. Thank you,
Great.
John.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure. Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
All right.
Industrial streets, class lines, money talks, turning language to paper pieces. Rich man's war, free man's society, raging violent insecurity. Nuclear man, nuclear woman, unclear how to act. Rich man's war, Pershings cruising Europe, America, Russia, governmental nuclear views, industrial allies cutting the world as though they cannot see blood flowing. Rich man's war, Central America bleeding, wounds same as Palestine and Harlem, 3 Mile Island in El Salvador, Pine Ridge in Belfast. Rich man's war, the poor, starving for food, starving for land, starving for peace, starving for real. Rich man's war, attacking human, attacking being, attacking earth, attacking tomorrow. Rich man's war, thinking of always war, thinking of always war. With machines for ancestors, new unborn generations, chemical umbilical cords are only wiring. In your electrical progress, human lives burnt offerings to the god greed. With lies for ancestors, there is no truth in some futures. Rulers of minds feeding next generation souls to the control machine. Sacrifice ritual for the proper technology. With isolation for ancestors, there's only the present, bought by the credit material uses. Forging chains binding you to destruction. Compliments of your deities, the industrial priest. Hiding an eon mask, have to face who we really are. Some point we have no choice. Distant star, distant light. In real world we are human being. In shadow of real world we are being human. Eon mask for neon flash. Distant thunder, distant cloud. Passion's rain. Drenched in possession, what we take is hard to do. What we do is hard to take. Some ones are crazy, or maybe we take turns. Dreaming about some kind of life, we say it could have been different. But it wasn't, because we weren't. No matter what, it turns out the same. A lot of things we said weren't true. Industrial stories in an electric instant. Eon mask. Neon flash. Neon flash. Thing is, nihilistic desires. Civilized, gone insane. Didn't imagine it turning like this. Some things start good and go bad. Some things get bad and stay bad. Are we caught in between living a lie or not living at all? Eliminated choices, lost in dreams we let go. Memories we never got to have, something else to think about. Waking up in industrial society surrounded by angry days. Going through motions of not being. Wanting the best but not expecting it. Surviving paid for in dreams. Feeling like a world alone. Serving God with the devil to pay. Feeling like something in no place. What goes on in hell anyway? Thing is, it has to do with heart. We have to understand what hearts are for before we can get back to heaven or paradise, or the power in our mind.
This is KZSC 88.1 FM, kzsc.org.